Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. I recently got to talk with Cheah Kai Wai, who's a fellow Silver Empire author. That is to say, Silver Empire is the publishing house that has published a few of my books. It's also published some of his. He's also a independent writer, a self-published author, I mean, and a very interesting person to talk to. He tends to write a bunch of espionage, but a whole bunch of other things too. His most recent book is called Hollow City, and it's part of the Superheroes Unleashed project from Silver Empire. And I unfortunately haven't read a lot of what he's written because I'm not reading much of any fiction lately. With 3 children and lots of projects, I just don't have much time for it. I did, however, read his what's now available as a book on Amazon, published originally as a serial called Invincible, about a Chinese warrior who's bonded with the Phoenix. It's a really, really good story. I really recommend that one from experience, and just I've gotten to read just snippets of his other writing. It's all really good. So I asked him to come talk with me about writing, both what he's doing and just the process of writing and so on, and also just to tell you a little bit about him. So he's Singaporean, born in Singapore, lives in Singapore, and so on. So this is from his about page on his website. As a child, I wanted to be an astronaut, a magician, and an inventor. I settled for being a writer. I am Singapore's first Hugo and Dragon Award-nominated science fiction and fantasy author. As Cheah Kai Wai, I published my work through independent presses, most notably the Covenant Chronicles and Song of Karma. As Chia Kit Sun, I write self-published fiction, posted on Steemit and elsewhere. You can also find the name Benjamin Cheah as well. So, yeah, he's written a lot. I mean, he's really dedicated to producing a lot of writing, and I'm really impressed by his output too. Anyway, so it was a really interesting conversation that we had, and I hope you enjoy watching it as much as I enjoyed being in it. So, as I understand, you have a book that just came out. Your latest is called Hollow City, which is part of the Heroes Unleashed program, right?
Yes.
We're both Silver Empire authors, amongst other things. But so, could you tell me a little bit about Hollow City?
Hollow City is the story of Adam Song, a superpowered cop who serves on the Halo City Police Department. One fateful evening, while serving a search warrant on a gang hitman, he is forced to kill 2 people in self-defense. Unfortunately, the hitman is the son of a drug lord, and the drug lord takes a contract on Adam Song. Within moments, the gang's after him, the media crucifies him, and his own police department has turned its back on him. He is washed up, left to dry, now he's forced to fend off gangsters and supervillains, all targeting him and his family. So to survive, he has become a vigilante.
Cool. I do like superhero stories. I actually have one that's going to come out in I forget what Russell said it's going to be called, the tangential universe, not the main stories like what you wrote. So that sounds pretty cool. So an interesting, in activities, very often one of the places one starts is how did you get into it? But one of the curious things about writing, and I forget who it was who said this, but basically everybody who can read thinks they can write a novel. So writing a novel is one of the few places where you don't need to ask somebody how they got into the idea of it, because that basically just means they can read. The real question, I think, is how did you get into the actually doing it to the point where you not only wrote the first few words of a novel, but actually wrote an entire one and then edited it and saw it through to publishing?
Well, I didn't really have a problem. I mean, it started when I was 12 years old, I think. I read a novel, I started to write my own, so I sat down and wrote it. After that, I decided, well, I already got a manuscript, might as well see it through to the end. So I edited it, I submitted for publication, never heard back from the publisher. So I shrugged and wrote my next novel, and on and on and on, and for the next 10 years or so years. And eventually, I started going self-publishing. I wrote a novel, published it, and then started getting attention from other publishers like Castelia House and Silver Empire.
So just from an early age, just sheer stick-to-itiveness?
Yep.
Cool. So now the topic that especially interests me, of course, is some of the nature of writing. And actually, I just read a blog post that you had put up on the nature of magic, which this is, I think, as good an entry into writing as any other, where your blog post was about demythologizing, or the demythologization of magic. Easier to write than to say, but and so there's an interesting. You talked about just sort of to give my own brief recap. Several points of magic. They're basically, as has been noted by a number of people, two sort of approaches. One is a magic as alternative technology approach, which we see a lot of, especially in the modern time. And the other is magic as something far more arcane and utterly beyond understanding. Now, one thing I didn't see you describe in this post, and this sort of comes up to the question I'm going to ask, is that it seems to me that the magic as alternative technology is primarily an outgrowth of magic as something that the main character has. Because there's sort of the fundamental problem in a story. If the main character can do anything, it's very hard for him to face any problems. And if it's completely unpredictable what the main character can do, even to the main character, you don't have so much of a story as a nightmare, because at no point does anything follow from what happened before. You're just kind of seeing one scene after another with no rational connection to each other. So to have a main character be a magician of some kind, you need magic as technology to have the sort of structure, versus the other kind, the more mythological magic, which works, I think can work very well when you have someone who's not the main character, because they don't need to follow rules, because they can only show up as much as necessary. So I'm curious, how much do you think that's true? That the magic as technology is the outgrowth of people saying, like, well, but what if the main character was actually this, what's normally a side character? And then this sort of became popular along that sort of route of taking what used to be a side character, the magician, the character in the shadows, and bringing him center stage and making him a main character.
It certainly looks that way. You see, using magic technology imposes limits on the main character. And by imposing these limits, it makes conflicts more interesting. You can't just have protagonist walks in the scene, says the magic word, problem disappears, and carry on, right? Yeah. So by having a magic system, is imposing limits on what the characters can do, which in turn requires the characters to think their way through the situation, or at least make creative use of the rules imposed upon them. And this is necessary for magic insofar as it's a method that's not seen in everyday life. So people want to know what it can do, what it can't do, and what people in that universe can or can't do and won't do with it. On the other hand, if a character is not a magician, these rules don't apply to him at all. So it really doesn't matter what kind of magic there is, only that it exists. So it can be an observer, he can be a viewpoint character, it can be someone other than a magician, and that's just fine. Because from the reader's perspective, it's not relevant. From the story perspective, it's not relevant. And to the character, he doesn't know about it, he doesn't need to know about it. So there's no need to have a magic technology system either.
That makes sense, and sort of accords with definitely with the way I was thinking of it. Now, an interesting thing, you talked a bit about some of the pulp masters like Howard in the Conan series, where magic tends to be a very dark sort of thing, and also Lovecraft, of course, you had mentioned. And something that I find interesting is if you go to a lot of older ideas of magic, and especially Western ideas of magic, you tend to be very well. Actually, there's an asterisk on that. They tend to be very sinister. Magic is very often making some sort of deal with the devil. The asterisk on that is there is actually a curious Christian tradition of magic in the late medieval grimoires, where the idea was that you were actually forcing demons to do things through the power of Christ, which is actually where a bunch of the symbols we associate within the West currently with demonology are all generally Christian symbols, like the Pentagon, for example, is the symbol of the 5 wounds of Christ. And so you're binding the demon inside of this because the holy power of the holy symbol would keep the demon from being able to hurt you. And then knowledge of that got lost. Now, I'm curious, because you're familiar with other traditions. How do you see, or how has magic been? But does it always tend to have that sinister quality in the more ancient traditions that you find in the East?
Well, outside the West, magic is treated far differently. In China, for example, magic tends to be this province of local gods or spirits or demons. So you want them to help, you make an offering, you make a request, you can hope for the best. Or magic is an inherent part of yourself. That is, you cultivate your chi, your life energy, you develop it inside you. And you want to do something supernatural, use that chi and turn it into whatever energy you need, like lightning or fireballs or the ability to fly, that kind of thing. In Japan, we see something similar to that. The idea of, firstly, of magic being the province of the divine or infernal, and magic coming from ki, the translation of chi. We also see Buddhist magic in Japan, more like esoteric Buddhism. So here you call upon various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas for help. You call upon them to guide you, to protect you from evil and illness, etc., etc. And you combine all this with hand symbols like mudras or mantras. And that in turn is, I think, is influenced by Hinduism, mudras and mantras especially. That's a Hindu practice, but it also bled over in Buddhism, being that it came from roughly the same region. Looking outside Asia, magic in Australia, the Australian Aboriginal, for example, is treated as part of the natural world, or rather, extension of natural world through the dreaming, the primordial state of creation. In the voodoo tradition, magic tends to be the province of the Loas, spirits spirits of wrath or spirits of peace, spirits who are closer to the earth than God himself. So instead of appealing to God, you appeal to the Loas for help. And well, I say every civilization has its own tradition that approaches the magic.
Yeah. Now, one thing actually, as you're describing the Chinese system, is that actually I'm sorry, the Chinese system of qi actually really sounds very reminiscent of many of the not like in the exact rules of it, but many of the more mechanical magic systems, magic as technology systems that the qi developed from within and harnessed through careful study and study that can be described to other people. So do you think there is a similarity there, or is that just a mistake on my part?
I would be surprised if there's a similarity. I mean, if we trace the history of magic systems in fiction and gaming, you see a lot of it leads to Japan, and from Japan, it leads to China. I mean, in Western gaming, began with magic is seen D&D, but that's the adventure system where magic users they memorize a spell, and once they use a spell, they forget the spell and need to memorize it again.
Oh, I hated that system.
Yeah, but in Japanese role-playing games, magic spells are permanent, but are cast on a pool of MP or magic points. Very similar to Chi, actually, if you think about it. And in Japan, as I said earlier, the idea of qi comes from qi. And in Chinese culture, in Chinese Taoist traditions, you learn how to cultivate your qi through qigong, tai chi, meditation, cultivation, herbs, and so on and so forth. And if I'm not mistaken, the MP format system, as opposed to venue system, only really took off after the rise of JRPGs in the late 80s, I think. Was it? At least a decade after
Sounds
D&D.
about right. Yeah, because
Yeah.
that's also about the time when they were so obviously better than the D&D system that D&D invented psionics, which is just magic with magic tools, because they couldn't just change magic for some reason at the time. Then they
Yeah.
changed it lots. Interesting. So, um, so on the other side, the Eldritch forces. So many of the systems you described tend to be more along the lines of just having another level of, like, another layer of the natural world that's more powerful than us, and
More
in some
subtle.
sense. I'm sorry, what?
More subtle as well.
More subtle?
Yeah.
Mm.
Like,
Less physical?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious what you think of the use of that style versus um, let me see, how would I describe it? Well, let's call it like the more demonic style, the sort of thing where magic always comes at a price and not a neutral price.
Hmm. From a storytelling perspective, the idea that magic comes from demons sets up interesting moral quandaries. Like, what price are you going to pay for power? How far do you want to go? What's the price you can accept in exchange for other outcomes? And I think it also ties into Christianity and Western traditions of law and order versus chaos and evil. On contrast, in a system where magic is seen as an organic outgrowth of reality, like chi-based systems or MP-based systems, what you have is essentially manipulation of the deeper laws of the universe. Not so much law versus order as who knows how to do something and what to do it, and maybe when to do it. So we get very different approaches to the world, very different aesthetics, and very different ideas of morality. In a world where magic comes from demons, striking a deal with the demons automatically evil. Whereas in a world where magic comes from innate talent, where magic is an extension of natural forces, magic is neutral. So the question is what the magic is used for and how, and the intent of the user, as opposed to it being automatically evil.
Mm. So, do you see that? Would you say that the chi type systems can work well as metaphors for more accessible sorts of powers that people have, be it wealth or physical strength or just social influence? That the aspect of human life that one can explore through these stories is that it lends itself well to being a metaphor for just ordinary human excellence.
Well, yes, actually. I mean, in traditional Taoist texts, cultivation of qi leads to superior health, superior strength, eyesight, and so on and so forth. So already cultivation of qi leads to human excellence by default. So you can, so in a story, you can extend it to metaphors like that, yeah.
Okay, and when I say metaphor, I don't mean like having a message that one wants to send. I very much like
Mhm.
that quote: "If you have a message, use Western Union," but rather to explore an idea um,
Mhm.
in a different setting. Because one of the curious things about the demonic style magic is that, as you said, when you make a deal with the devil, it's automatically immoral, and part of that is because the nature of morality is. Such that, the things which are moral are the things which are conducive to good, which are conducive to being, and the things which are immoral are things which are destructive. And so, since everything demonic is a twisting of the natural within the Christian framework, um, there becomes the very interesting question of, you raised the question, what are you willing to do for power? And then the problem that always adheres to any deal with the demonic is that it's an attempt to fall out a window and stop before you hit the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so one could see, like, so there's plenty of medieval literature. Several of the takes on Dr. Faustus come to mind, which basically explore that possibility that the way down may be nice, but you can't simply stop before you hit the ground because you like where you are. Which is actually a fairly good, come to think of it, metaphor for the way a lot of cultural degeneration works. That
Yeah.
You see people who are shocked and surprised that people took cultural degeneration a step further than they themselves wanted, as if it's possible to just stop falling at any time before you hit the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious. So bring it back for magic to writing a little bit more generally. When you approach writing, so do you think, like, is your starting point? Because I mean, everyone has to have both structure, plot structure and structure, as well as characters. But you have to start somewhere. And so between those, do you tend to start more with your plot, or do you tend to start more with your characters and then work to the other way?
Most of the time, it starts with one character and what he does. So in a sense, the character and the plot are intertwined. Like in Hollow City, I want to tell a story of a superpowered cop who is forced to go rogue, as well. And then from there, we're just setting the plots, the other characters that make the story possible, and on and on and on.
Okay. So, I mean, and of course, you're entirely correct that the plot, at least in a halfway decent story, the plot and the characters are intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
If you can slot any character into the plot, it's a very iffy sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And even worse if the character doesn't actually fit into the plot. So, I entirely agree, of course, that the plot and the characters are intertwined. And it's kind of, I'm actually kind of curious. Is a cop forced to go rogue really more of a plot or more of a character?
Yes. Well, you need the kind of personality that's willing to even contemplate the idea to begin with. And then you need actions that push him off the edge. So you need both character and plot.
Yeah, and then of course, once you have the plot that you need, then that dictates what sort of characters could actually set that in motion.
Yep.
Because they're choices, but they're limited choices. I found that actually in giving writing advice to some people, when they're stuck on a plot, that I'll always try to address it in terms of, well, the character that you've got here he's not the sort of person to do the thing you need him to do, so you need to introduce something else that will make him want to do the thing you need to do. And oddly, I've often found that's not received very well.
Mm.
Do you give much writing advice yourself? Are you
Not
too
in
busy
person.
writing the many, many stories you write to have time for it?
Well, I don't give writing advice in person, but I do help when people ask me. For one thing, I am pretty busy these days. I mean, I'm working something like 3 jobs, including writing. And for another, well, I'm not part of the writing scene in Singapore, so what to do?
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I am impressed, by the way, with the output that you've been managing. I've my time for reading is remarkably short at present, owing to several small children. But I very much enjoyed your well, it's also collected as a book, but it's serial is the way I first saw it, was Invincible,
Mm-hmm.
um, which was for those who haven't read it, and I recommend it highly. Well, actually, why the heck would I summarize it when you're here? Could you describe Invincible briefly?
Invincible follows Zhang Wudi, aka Zhang the Invincible, who is a soldier in the Empire's divine troops. One day, he's tasked with suppressing rebels, but it turns out the rebels have allied themselves with monsters from the north. And so it's plunged in conspiracy to defeat the conspiracy before they can overrun the frontier.
Okay, and where he gets his name, the Invincible, from is that he's bonded in some sense to a fire spirit.
Yep, a phoenix.
Which provides all sorts of interesting character relations. Is that because the two don't have exactly similar. They have consonant goals, or at least some of their goals are consonant, and hence their union. But they're not. They don't have all the same goals, which provides some interesting conversations between the two of them.
Mm-hmm.
And other scenes. Now, one of the things I found I very much enjoyed about the stories was that it really, in English story, gave a very strong Chinese flavor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious if you can describe, as you're writing an English story, how you went about creating, such a Chinese flavor and making it accessible to an English-speaking audience who may not be, familiar with much of anything about China.
Well, when I was younger, I grew up reading books like Journey to the West or The Water Margin, translated in English. So I drew upon my experience of that, specifically how the characters were described, how the events and places were described, and how they were translated from Chinese to English. When I was in primary school, I found books that had the manuscript of the text of a book in Chinese on one page and the translation of English on its next to it. So reading Chinese and English simultaneously. So you get to see how phrases and names are translated into English. In some places, you even see footnotes are translated that explain things like, what does "out the cat" mean? Or what does a yamen mean, for example? In this case, the government compound. So I drew upon this, and I went further by saying, I want to write a story where everyone speaks Chinese, everyone thinks in Chinese, but it's translated for an English-speaking audience. So I thought about the expressions they would use, the terminology they would use, the fashions, the culture, the etiquette. I took all that, translated in English, and added some context so that a Western audience understand it, such as, say, the currency you use, like a gold or silver ingot, the culture-specific things or idioms like as easy as tying the back of a hand, or political terms like 县长, which in English means magistrate, but this term does not mean a judge. A 县长doesn't just enforce the law. He's also the local leader, like a mayor or a governor. So he's in charge of public works, resolving disputes, mobilizing the military, and enforcing the law. I chose to keep 县长 in this case because the magistrate doesn't quite capture the entirety of his duties. So in this sense, it's immersing myself in Chinese culture and then thinking about how to explain it properly to an English-speaking audience without going overboard in detail.
It's also interesting the selective non translation.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting subject. The leaving of a few words untranslated, where they don't, and then you build up the meaning. I presume the idea then is you build up the meaning through the story, so that by the end the reader knows what the word actually means experientially.
Yeah, that's especially in the case of Zhang Wudi. Wudi is translated as invincible in this story, right? But Wudi literally means no enemies. And halfway through the story, a priest says, "You truly have no enemies, Zhang Wudi," which means essentially he kills them all. He's so merciless that he leaves no one alive, and that is one of his major moral failings.
Interesting.
It's actually the Zhang Wu Di is actually a nickname of an actual martial arts master who lived in the 19th century. He was literally unbeatable.
Huh.
But more than that, he defeated his enemies in such a way that they did not resent him. He did not break their bones. He did not pummel them. He didn't humiliate them. He simply outlasted them. He frustrated all the attempts at attacking him and utilized all their techniques. So nothing they did could affect him. With a punch or kick or grapple, he just moved out of the way, or he grappled the guy in such a way that he didn't hurt him, but the other guy couldn't do anything about him. So he's really had no enemies.
Interesting.
In the sense that no one could fight him, and no one hated him.
That's very, very interesting. I think that's. By the way, did you happen to see the Lego Ninjago series?
I don't think so.
I wouldn't expect you to. I think it's a children's story, really, and I happen to have seen a lot of children's television in the last roughly 6 years since my oldest child's been able to watch television. It's not very good overall, but it's got certain, like so many things, it's not all that good, but it occasionally has certain glimmers that are much better than the rest of it. And it's got the setup of there are several ninja, and there's the Master Wu who teaches the Sensei Wu who teaches them. And there's one lesson he gives, which is actually decent. And he at the beginning of the episode, he asked them, "What's the best way to defeat an enemy?" And then throughout, they keep on coming up with various answers of training, teamwork. I think one of them gave the answer spin kick, and he kept on saying, "No, you need to, go and think about it more." And then finally, at the very end of the episode, when they had rehabilitated an enemy. And he actually, when joined their team, he gave, they just gave up, and he gave the answer that the best way to defeat an enemy is to make him your friend.
Mm-hmm.
And that just, it reminds me. I've seen that thing several times, so it's far more burned into my brain than it really should be. But that reminded me very much, or I was reminded very much of that with what you're saying about the martial artist who had no enemies, because when he would fight people, he didn't make enemies during a fight, and so that's a really it's a very interesting position to be in, that he was able to make it so that no one could hurt him, but at the same time he also gave them no cause to come back.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very interesting. Very interesting, and a very interesting starting point for starting point may not be the right word, but for your story. So now you also I haven't read any of yours in this genre, but you also have a number of stories in the genre of the phrase the spy thriller is coming to mind, but that's not quite right. But what's the name of that genre where you have spycraft, except there's
espionage.
Espionage.
Yeah.
So now, although you've also blended espionage with magic systems, right? In at least some of your stories.
The Covenant Chronicles.
So now, have you done straight espionage without supernatural things blended in?
When I was younger, but those stories weren't published.
So just a change of interest, or?
When I was younger, I wrote a spy series featuring a Singaporean Black Ops agency. The mission would travel on the region to conduct counterterrorism and other operations to protect the country. But after I finished the story, I realized that no Singaporean publisher would take it. And not only that, if I tried to switch them to an American team or other Western team, I wouldn't be able to compete with the other authors in the market. I wouldn't be able to go overseas to do research I didn't have the money to buy research materials. I couldn't even go out and fire a gun even. I was 16 at the time, by the way. So I thought, if I can't do things authentically, I must well make things up. So I threw in science fiction and fantasy elements, and you have the Covenant Chronicles.
Interesting. I like that. If I can't do it authentically, I'll make it up. And I've done something similar, and I can definitely tell, because I have an interest in historical fiction, but man, is there an enormous amount of work if you want to try to do historical fiction accurately.
Oh yeah.
And although that is its own thing, I spoke with, I don't know if you're familiar with Rachel Fulton Brown, Professor Rachel Fulton Brown. She's a historian. And one of the things we spoke about was historical fiction. And the interesting thing there is that one of the points that sort of came up in that conversation, which is, I think, relevant here, is that in a real sense, you can't actually do accurate historical fiction. That for various reasons, one of which is that people's concerns are different at different times. What motivates people is different at different times. And it is all but impossible to really properly capture what motivated people in a way that is intelligible to people who have different motivations today. And so one example being the relation, the proper relationship of the Lord to the underling is something that was a very hot topic of discussion all throughout the Middle Ages. It's really difficult to a modern audience, especially in a modern, I'm most familiar with American audiences, but in a modern democracy, to really bring that across in a way that a person could then relate to. Because if you really present it authentically, it's going to actually be concerned with that relationship of Lord to underling, which doesn't exist in the modern world, and we have no experience of it in the modern world. And so we can't really directly relate to it. And so it's only a sort of a very few people who have a real passion for history of getting to the mind of someone utterly unlike themselves who could ever understand that. So you can't really do that in a popular novel because no one could read it. Almost nobody could read it. So that was one example. There are a bunch of others too, because just the ways people have of relating to things, just even in their leisure activities and so on, is so different that your ability to know entirely what life was like is very, very limited. And so you're going to have to fill in details, and you're going to end up filling in details from the present, not from the past, and sort of necessarily falsifying things. Now, I'm curious, do you think that there's something analogous when it comes to like espionage fiction that if you're not actually telling the historical chronicle of a particular actual espionage thing from your own experience, you're going to have to be filling things in from imagination anyway, even if you can do large amounts of research?
Absolutely. I mean, I've read biographies of spies and they recount actual espionage operations. I can tell you, 99.99% of operations are completely and totally boring. Yeah. You sit at a desk, you stare at paper to see if it makes sense. You go to a cafe, you talk to your informant and hope he's not lying to you. You go to some remote place in the desert, you sit down, you line up the camera, you take photographs of an airbase, and you hope no one discovers you. But it's so far away, no one notices you anyway. Or you're following this guy, you basically walk around the street of the city all day and just watching go by his daily life. It's really, really boring. I mean, the conventional reader, you just close the book after the first few pages. And I know this, and there's this author, Andy McNabb, who wrote the novel Liberation Day. He wrote it like a spy thriller, an extremely authentic spy thriller, in that the protagonist basically follows suspected terrorists all day and talk to each other on the radio. And he did it for dozens of chapters. So it's basically dozens of chapters of I follow him here, I talk on the radio, I did this. I went follow him to another place. Rinse and repeat.
So I mean, like he went to the laundromat, he read a book,
Yeah,
finally his laundry was done.
yeah, things like that. I mean, it's authentic, yeah, but it's boring, and you don't want to bore the reader. So you have to make things up along the way. Espionage fiction and fiction must be more exciting than actual espionage, or no one want to read it. So in my case, you got two. So generally speaking, you got two choices. First, you skip the boring parts. You compress everything down in a few chapters and say, he did this, did it, blah blah blah. Then go to the next exciting part. Or you introduce complications during the mission, like get a guy inside, figures that you're following him, or something happens to your target, things like that. And then this forces the character to adapt, and this introduces complexities to the mission, and that's more exciting.
Yeah, the problem being that in real life you don't want anyone to notice you, so you actually take the precautions so that people don't notice you. And so,
Yeah.
Just a small, very hopefully small tangent. You know that that thing about how sufficiently you can't tell the difference between a Poe and a um, sufficiently extreme extremist.
Yep.
You actually can, and the way you can tell the difference is whether or not there's the presence of boring material. If a person's just a complete extremist, the thing is he's utterly normal to himself, and so he will include all of the normal, utterly boring things that he actually does share with everybody else in whatever screeds that he has. He's odds are extremely good that no matter how much of a lunatic this person is, he's still reasonably in favor of things like other people washing their hands before passing him food. And so, and just all sorts of utterly banal things that nobody takes issue with, that everybody has, to some degree has to remind because, fallen human beings. And so if somebody is a sufficiently advanced extremist, they will still include all those things. There'll be the boring stuff as well as the interesting stuff. Whereas the imitation for the sake of humor is going to ally to all those parts because he knows he's in on the joke. Whereas the actual extremist is not in on the joke.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't know what the joke is, which is sort of what makes him the extremist. So that's the way to tell the difference between the Poe and the sufficiently advanced extremist. And so it's remarkably similar to what you're talking about, that if you make it realistic, you'd have to include a tremendous amount of boring material because that's what most of life is. Because after all, keeping life boring is how you stay alive.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the best way to dodge bullets is or the best way to not be shot is to not have anybody shooting at you.
Yeah.
And so being really, 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 really far away when you take your pictures is a really good idea, but tends to make for nothing much happening.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, please.
Exactly. If you're doing it right, then life is boring. But boring doesn't make good fiction.
Yeah, and it's actually, there's a related thing when it comes to warfare. And not that I don't think you've written any like war stories, have you?
Yet.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Because I haven't yet either. But one of the things that's interesting is I've done a bit of historical reading. Was that warfare does generally tend to be remarkably slanted towards defense. And there are occasional exceptions when you have technological shifts, and what used to be slanted towards defense doesn't work so well, and then you get lots and lots of death. World War I probably being one of the best examples of where there's the new mechanized things and poison gases and so on that the previous defenses weren't any good at until people adapted. But for most of history, the way people fought was in large lines where you're shoulder to shoulder with other people who are on your side, and you have you've got basically a knife on the end of a long stick so the other guy isn't going to be anywhere near you. And so you've got these 2 lines full of knives on the end of very long sticks pointed at each other, that are really good at swatting each other away, and then everybody's carrying a big flat piece of wood that's really good at not being pierced by a knife on the end of a stick. And so most of the time, the people who show up to a battle also leave the battle. It's the small minority of battles where one side is actually completely destroyed. And so they happen, and you can find plenty of stories of them happening, and then people going, killing all the survivors and so on. But it's actually pretty rare historically, because, again, also for other related things, if the other guys really outnumber you that badly, you're not going to fight. So you're only going to hold up your knife on the end of a long stick if there's some purpose to this that involves you plausibly coming out alive. Unless you're one of those 300 Spartans, in the passive Thermopylae, and some other exceptions. But as a statistical thing, most people come home from wars. And so, again, there's sort of the curious thing about wars that there's a lot of marching, an awful lot of marching, a lot of moving, and if you're Roman, an awful lot of building. But there's not nearly as much fighting, because the fighting is not the part. You don't really want to be doing that, because you don't stay alive nearly as well if you're actually doing that part. And so there's an interesting sort of similarity, I think, between what you're describing in espionage and in war stories, where, again, war is primarily boring because that's what everybody involved wants it to be. It's much better than the exciting parts for the people involved, for the most part.
Absolutely. If it's exciting, it means you're getting shot at or getting blown up.
So when it comes to writing, now taking that reality is that the people involved all want to keep it boring for themselves. Now, they may prefer boring where they have a massive advantage over the other side, and the other side gives up. That is their desired type of boring. But given that everybody involved has a vested interest in keeping things boring, that poses the interesting problem to the writer of how do you stay true to this to some degree, but then not let them actually succeed at making it boring without doing the classic thing that you see in like the terrible D&D movie. I remember something like 20 years ago when I saw the thief walking around, all but like walking around like this backwards in the dungeon, and I go, oh, he's about to get caught. That's to say, where he just started doing incredibly stupid things for no discernible reason, and okay, I see the plot has to be moved on now. So, how do you see, in writing, being true to the people involved and not moving the plot along by just making them stupid?
Well, go the opposite way and make everyone intelligent. Well, less facetiously, the thing about deception, surprise, and concealment of information from the reader. So, for example, in Invincible, we know that there is a conspiracy afoot. The question is, what form does it take? Why would they want to do it? So our hero has to keep going on. He has to fight against overwhelming odds, but because he's got a fire spear by his side, it's not so overwhelming. However, the bad guys already know that he's after him, that there are more soldiers like him hunting them, so they take pains to conceal their plans. They don't overly shout their plans in public. They try to hunt him down so he can't figure out what's going on. And when they do move the troops, they do it, let's just say they conceal their movements. Likewise, in other fiction, you want bad guys who know that the good guys are after them and will take steps to hide their plans or to follow the good guys. And you want good guys who know that's coming, so they have to prepare ahead of time for whatever surprises on their way. Then you want that to hide information from the reader, like, in fiction, there's this plan. There's usually scenes where the heroes sit on a table and say, "Okay, so here's what I'm gonna do," and cut the next scene. Yeah. So you want scenes like that to hide from the reader. You want to the plan may go. I mean, the mission may go exactly according to plan from the hero's perspective, but the reader doesn't know that. So the reader is always taken by surprise. especially if something happens. And on a micro level, you want deception at the character level. That is, everyone's hiding something from everybody else, like their capabilities, information, or weapons. In Hollow City, for example, a hero, Adam Song, is officially able to amplify his strength and senses. But in reality, he can do a lot more than that. He's just not telling anyone. But other supervillains think the same way he does. So they're hiding their powers too. So from a writing perspective, you want to hide as much information as you can from the reader and from other characters and trot them out when it's appropriate.
Interesting. Interesting. The which of course also needs to be balanced out against revealing information and keeping the story intelligible.
Yeah.
And also fulfilling promises. It's sort of easy to come up with a catalog of television and movies provide a great catalog of people doing it wrong for any technique that exists. But so, see, just trying to think of how to put this in a sensible question. So, like, when you've done it, how have you thought explicitly about balancing out the hiding of information with the, in a sense, playing fair with the reader and fulfilling promises that you've made earlier? Because it can be very disorienting, for example, for a book to completely switch genres.
Yeah.
Where once you find out the actual information, now you're in a completely different story than you started with.
Oh yeah. I've actually seen it happen before. It's desperate, to say the least.
Yeah, there's a fun example. I saw Basil Rathbone, Sherlock Holmes, watching the movie The Woman in Green, made in 1939, I think it was, for historical research. Or no, 42, I think. Anyway, somewhere in that range. And the mystery took up, roughly speaking, about the first half, a little bit under the first half of the story. Then it was completely solved. And then the second half of the movie was just all about how to catch the villain. So it switched from being a mystery to being an adventure story in which there was absolutely nothing to discover. Which was really strange. They completely wrapped up everything about, roughly 4/10 of the way in. And then it just switched over to this completely linear, he has to, basically he just goes and puts himself in the hands of the villains and then escapes type plot. It's just very, very strange, because in the second half, I signed up for a mystery story. What am I watching right now? And I'm sure you can come up with examples of that sort of thing too.
Yeah. So to prevent that and to ensure that you fulfill readers' promises, you have to be really careful with what information you choose to reveal early on. And get really careful with setting up Chekhov's gunmen. In the Covenant Chronicles, for example, there are actually 3 conflicts in there. The first conflict is between the hero and the terrorist group. The second conflict is between the hero and a global conspiracy that wants to rule the world. But the third conflict is between the old gods and embodiment of evil. And all 3 conflicts intertwine and intersect with each other at very interesting times. So what we have are gods and angels constantly reminding the main character, Luke Landon, that they are watching over him. And also remind the reader that they will intervene if they think it advances their strategy. Not necessarily in the hero's favor, but in their own favor. So if it's the advantage to leave the hero be in a tight situation, that they leave him alone. But if they find that if intervening situation will advance their own plot, they will do it. So that's what happens throughout the series. You have gods and angels appearing either to give advantage or to grant advantage to one party or another. Not the good angels, by the way. These are demons showing up to aid the opposition at the most inconvenient times. But since it's also a meta conflict of gods versus fallen angels and stuff, it makes sense that we have supernatural beings showing up at decisive moments to attempt to sway the events in their favor.
That actually. So did you end up occasionally? The hero's in a tight spot, and a supernatural being shows up and gets him out of it. But you sort of pay for that rescue with the mystery of why did he do this, and am I just out of the frying pan to be in the fire?
Oh yeah. In this story universe, it follows the Christian framework of magic coming from demonic forces. So in this, our hero Luke Langdon gets his powers from old gods, but to everyone else, it looks like it's demonic powers, and the punishment for that is capital punishment. So he has to hide his powers all the time. He can't reveal why he did it or how he did it. And every time someone asks him, so how do you do it? He just comes with a plausible explanation on the spot. And not only that, the old gods that he's allied with aren't necessarily his allies. They see him not as an ally, but as a useful pawn. Or at least that's how he thinks they see him. And sometimes they don't, they act in a way that reinforces his perceptions. So he's constantly thinking, what is actually going on? What are the long-term ramifications of this act of accepting their offer, and so on and so forth.
Interesting. I like that. I like that setup, and that the balancing of several things simultaneously pitted against each other. Interesting. But if I might return to a somewhat earlier topic that we had, a question I had, an interesting, a very wide-known cultural phenomenon is the original Star Wars. And I'm thinking the first 3 movies of Star Wars. I prefer to just pretend that the prequels were never made, and the sequels aren't really Star Wars anyway. So, and they don't even want to be Star Wars, so I just don't count them. And but within the first 3, the Force seems to occupy simultaneously, or either that or completely undecidedly, both the Christian framework of magic, where you have you have the light and the dark side, which has good and evil, and moreover that the dark side is faster. That the dark side is not more. It's not that the dark side is more powerful, but the dark side is a much quicker way to get to power. That the light side proceeds according to its own lights. If you'll pardon the double meaning there. Whereas the dark side is much more willing to serve you in the short term, though it will destroy you. But at the same time, the Force seems to have much more of a being chi. It's life energy. It's just an extension of the natural world, more rarefied. So I'm curious what you think of Star Wars in those terms, and whether you go for it being schizophrenic and Lucas couldn't tell what he was doing, or if there's a more subtle interpretation that's not simply at odds with itself.
There is a more subtle interpretation, but you need to be really well versed in esoteric Buddhism and Taoism to see it. In the sense that the light and dark side it's a Western paradigm, yeah. But if you look at it from an Eastern perspective, from the perspective of Taoism and Buddhism, you see similar ideas. In that you can get results quicker if you use forceful means, by imposing a will on others, by dominating others. But in doing so, you're sitting on the seat of your own self-destruction. Like you'll burn yourself out, or you'll make a lot of enemies and you'll come to hate you. eventually make an enemy you can't afford to make. In contrast, the light side of the force is more of cooperation and creating harmony with others. So you're healing people, making them your friends and allies. And so while it takes a longer time, it also creates goodwill. And through goodwill, you make allies, making you all the more powerful. And I think it ties into the Buddhist concept of karma, in that if you focus on dominating others and destroying others, you too will be destroyed. Whereas you focus on building people up, people will aid you in return.
Interesting. Interesting. And Lucas was, I believe, fairly influenced, at least somewhat influenced by Eastern thinking. I mean, there are definitely well, I mean, everybody kind of seeks to overcome their emotions because, after all, the only sensible way to live is rationally in control of yourself. So there's nothing especially Buddhist about the idea of controlling your emotions. But at the same time, I believe he was. Do you happen to know better than I whether he was influenced by Western, by Buddhist thought as filtered through whatever ways it got to him?
Well, it's something fairly obvious in Star Wars. The Force, for example, you can basically substitute it for Chi and throw in Buddhism and Taoism. It doesn't pass judgment like the Christian God would, but there are consequences for using the Force in specific ways. And those consequences will come back to haunt you, for good or ill.
Yeah, I can definitely see that interpretation. Is there any Eastern parallel analog to the Jedi Knights? Because I mean, they're a very strange organization.
Yeah.
You know, a collection who don't really serve anybody and sort of serve everybody, and they kind of govern themselves.
Yeah, there is actually. The Yuxia from China, wandering heroes, wandering swordsmen. They're the heroes of wuxia and xianxia fiction, about a martial hero who goes around protecting the people using martial arts. But those are based on real phenomena. I think in the 17th to 19th centuries or thereabouts, in periods of weak rulership, when the king is either weak or corrupt, when bandits and warlords rule the land, people started wandering China to protect innocents using martial arts. They follow their own code of honor. In wuxia fiction, they have their own societies and organizations. But generally, they use the martial arts to protect the weak, to expose the corrupt, to suppress bandits, and generally do good. You can see the parallel in Jedi Knights, except that the Jedi are a bit more organized than the Yuxia.
Interesting. Although there's a parallel too, isn't there? To I'm trying to place it time period wise. I think it was primarily like French literature in like the 1400s, but like the courtly stories around like the King Arthur, where you would have the wandering knights who would go around.
Yeah, there was that too.
So it's I don't think Lucas would have based them off of Arthurian legends or anything surrounding that. I'm more just thinking of because of course the China and medieval Europe had medieval Europe had, with limits, fairly similar social organizations. I mean, you know, in the you know, in which I mostly mean just the not aristocratic, the feudal system with many layers to it, where there are a fair number of lords who themselves would have overlords, and so having that sort of feudal structure, and also you would have it be strong and weak and break down, and then you'd have similar problems of bandits that can roam and so on, and sometimes it's dealt with well and sometimes not, and so on. So they're to some degree, I think I'm just describing that similar environments will tend to produce similar things when you have human beings in both of them, rather than anything of any deep significance there. So I'm trying to think. I had this other question in the back of my head, and I unfortunately haven't been able to think of it. But we've been talking for quite some time, so it's probably a good time to wrap up and keep the thing at vaguely watchable length. I should ask, as we're wrapping up, what are you working on now?
A cyberpunk series titled Singularity Sunrise.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, Singularity Sunrise is set in the 22nd century. Humanity is on the brink of technological singularity. Advances in genetics, robotics, information technology, and nanotechnology are about to bring humanity to the posthuman age. But for everybody who wants to empower people, there's someone who wants to rule the world. This story is about the emergence of a sentient artificial intelligence, the first of its kind, and how it affects the world. It is seen through the eyes of James Morgan, a psychic spy whose destiny is entwined with the AI. So his mission officially is to protect the AI from terrorists and rogue states. They want to duplicate the AI and use it to impose dictatorship or to destroy the old world. However, James Morgan is a baseline human. He may be a psychic, but he has almost entirely rejected cybernetics. He's just an ordinary person in a world that's leaving him behind. So, on one level, this story is about impact technology on society and humanity. On another level, this is about how man finding place in such rapidly changing times. And on a third level, it's where technology is a force of progress or for oppression.
Interesting. Is this going to be a serial or a novel, or how is it?
It's a series of 6 novels, self-published, I think, but we'll see how that turns out.
Okay. Well, something very much to look forward to. Well, thank you very much. It's been quite a pleasure.
Thanks for having me here.
Well, once again, I hope you enjoyed watching that as much as I enjoyed being in that conversation. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.